kitchen we were making pasta, so it only makes sense that we're back here to make our very own pasta sauce. And my dad is here to help us with that one, so take it away, Dad.
All right, we start with garlic. And we need to clean the garlic and get it all ready to go. What I'm doing right now is I'm taking the stems out and I'm just putting the bulbs together in a big pile. We will finish doing that, and then we start sauteing the garlic in olive oil, and then that's the base for the sauce, and then we start making the tomatoes into that. So rather than showing you cleaning the garlic, we will pause this and continue on later once it's ready to actually be sauteed. Okay, next step. Once we have picked the onions and garlic, we need to clean the onions and garlic, which we have done, and then next we'll cook them. First, what I'm doing right now is taking the ends of the garlic off. Most of this garlic is going to go into storage, so you can see it's going into a jar full of olive oil. That's going to go into the fridge, and we'll have wonderful garlic-infused olive oil for cooking all winter long. The other bit of this will end up in the pot, and it'll get sauteed a little bit before we put in the processed tomatoes. So the process of making sauce is a long one, and we're just now getting started. We're also going to dice up the onions that will be put into the pot. The pot on the stove has a significant amount of olive oil in it, and that's what we're going to turn on to get ready to saute everything. Okay, and then the garlic gets chopped up. Normally you do this with a knife. I'm going to do this with a little bit of a rotary device because it's a lot quicker this way. And that way the garlic
is much slower.
Yeah, the knife would be a lot slower. And lickety split. The garlic is all chopped into the hot oil. There's a little bit of a few of them that didn't get chopped, but that's okay. They'll go in whole. And then Michael, what happens next?
You cook it.
You cook it, that's right. Now, we're going to turn that off and let the residual heat from the burner finish cooking the onions. And I wish we had smell-o-vision so that you guys could appreciate what the kitchen is beginning to smell like. It smells pretty good. And then the next step is that we need to process the tomatoes. Okay, the next step is that we need to just blanch the tomatoes for 5 minutes, 15 minutes tops, 5 to 10 minutes usually. Just enough to get them soft enough so that when we process them later on, they will run through the tomato mill a little bit more easily than they would otherwise. So just throw them in pots, fill them with water, bring it to a boil, let it go for another 5 minutes after it actually hits boil. My cousins do this in their garage. They have setups where they just take over the entire 2-car garage with processing this thing, and they will put all of the cousins together, bring all of the kids and all of the adult children together, and they just make a whole day of this and take care of it, and they can anything between 100 and 150 quarts of tomato sauce in one sitting. I don't do that much. But as you can tell from just, I mean, this is maybe a quarter of the tomatoes we've got.
Maybe.
You don't do this 1 can at a time either. You make this in large batches. You can it, it sits on the shelf, and you use it when you're ready to it. The other way to do this would be simply quarter the tomatoes and make sauce each and every time you do it. It's a lot more time consuming. This way you can just pull the sauce out of the jar, put it on the warm pasta sauce, heat it through, and you've got a meal. It makes things a lot quicker that way, right guys?
Right.
Okay. We'll be back to process the tomatoes later. Okay, the next step is that we need to actually mill the tomatoes into sauce. There is a very old device that works perfectly for this. It's the same sort of mill that you use to make applesauce and grape juice and a bunch of other things, but essentially what it is a combination of a screw and a sieve. So nothing, simple machines. But the way this works is that once you assemble it, the tomatoes will go inside. This mill is relatively recent vintage. Bought it in the 1970s, 1980s. Thank you, Michael. However, my mother and father had one just like this, except that all of the parts were metal instead of the plastic parts that this one has. The plastic parts are a concession to the world today and the economics of things. Almost forgot to put the washer in. There's washers that hold the various pieces in so that the tomatoes won't leak out. And as you can see, this is all thumb screws, so it's designed to be put together with no tools. This, they make electric versions of this as well as the hand crank one, but the hand crank one works just fine, and the difference in cost is phenomenal. So unless you're going to be doing this professionally, it doesn't make any sense to buy the electric one. But the other big difference between this and the ones that my parents had is that the shield that goes over, my parents, it just fit underneath it so that the tomatoes would tend to spring out and cause leakage and all kinds of other mess. This one is not exactly non-messy, but it's not as messy as the one that my parents had. But you can tell we're doing this outside for a reason. You don't want to do this in an area where you're going to have to clean up afterward. I'll let nature clean up with a little rain afterward.
And Nona appreciates it.
Okay. Now with this put together, we're going to put this on the chair. And then tighten this down. Okay. And tomatoes go in, you spin the crank, the juice comes out this way, the pulp and the seeds come out this way, and you have sauce at the end of the process. And then you just need to boil it down. So we'll start the process of putting the sauce together. I'm going to get the kids to help me spin the crank. Okay, now Helen's going to spin the crank. Michael's going to push the tomatoes in. This way.
So these tomatoes have been on the stove in a little bit of water.
Just blanch them for 10-15 minutes tops. Enough to make them soft. You see the sauce starting to come out?
Keep going. Michael, you're going to have to lift up the plunger so those tomatoes Papa just added can go down. There you go.
Guts.
And then the sauce comes out and falls into the pan. And the guts fall out the end and end up in the other pan. It's a lot easier than trying to strain it by hand. And like I said before, it's just a simple machine. It's a screw. You're going the wrong way, Helen. It's just a screw and a sieve.
And how many times do you run the tomatoes through, Papa?
Usually 2.
So the insides that are falling out get run through again.
Yep.
Guts.
A lot of guts.
Okay.
Tomato guts.
So we're going to let them keep going. And then we'll be back.
And this actually, let me show you how one person can do this. You have your hand, you put it in there, and you just spin.
What about 2 people?
Well, how are you and Helen doing it?
Michael turn. I want to do it. Have to watch.
Okay, the next step, once the tomatoes are sauced, is that you need to reduce it, simmer it for a long time. This pot has been simmering. It actually started out with both of these pots full. It has simmered for about 6.5, 7 hours, and it's reduced from 2 pots down to 3/4 of a pot. It needs to reduce just a little bit more, but as you can tell, it's kind of saucy at this point as opposed to just running liquid. And that's what you want. It needs to be a little bit thicker before we're completely done with that. But I've already started the sauce process, the spicing process. Basic spices, salt, pepper, a little bit of dried oregano, dried basil, dried rosemary that's crushed so that you can get the aromatics out of it. You just crush it with your basic mortar and pestle. In addition to those kinds of spices, the ones that I put in that are not typically found in tomato sauce are cinnamon and a little bit of vanilla extract. I like the way that kind of brings out the umami a little bit. And I learned something today. Umami is how you say it in Italian too. Apparently everybody's borrowed the Japanese word because nobody had a word that the Japanese had. In addition to that, parsley, fresh basil, fresh parsley, that sort of thing as well. And the list of ingredients will have everything that should be in there. I don't remember if I put amounts in or not. I never measure. It's just done to taste. And then the last thing that you add to the whole process is about 2 glasses of wine. And there's no such thing as cooking wine, just a good drinking wine. And you put that in there. And then if you want...
White or red?
Red. And then if you want to add a little bit more acidity to it, which I tend to want to do because it makes it can better at the end of that, I use a good balsamic vinegar to add just a little bit of acidity to it. About a pan like this size would take about a cup, maybe a little less than a cup of balsamic vinegar. So 2 glasses of wine and maybe a cup of balsamic vinegar. And then you taste it. Decide whether or not it needs anything. Sometimes the tomatoes are a little bitter. You got to add a little bit of sugar to them. That is not necessary with most tomatoes, but every once in a while, some years, you got to add a little sugar to make them more palatable. Other years, you add more salt. Sometimes people like to put in monosodium glutamate. I don't particularly like MSG, so I don't put that in mine, but that's also a perfectly appropriate kind of thing to kind of bring all the flavors out. And you want to get that blended tomatoey umami flavor in there in order to make it work well. And then once it's sauced, the next step is to can, and we'll do that last. Okay, last step, as we've been making sauce, is to actually process the cans and put it into the hot water pressure cooker bath to seal the cans. So we started out, it's important everything be warm. We started out with warm jars, warm sauce. Put them into each individual can here. I am boiling the lids and getting them nice and soft. Usually it takes about 5 minutes or so of boiling in order to make sure that the rubber on the lid gets nice and soft. The beauty of modern canning equipment is that it is pretty much foolproof. If it seals, it's sealed. It's not like the old jars where you had the rigid glasses and a rubber around them, and sometimes they didn't quite seal and you couldn't tell for sure. This you know. And one of the best sounds in the world is that pop when the seal happens. So let's start with the jars. We've got the ring. And we need a lid. How about just one lid? I have discovered that it's important to make sure that the rim is clean and that there's no sauce or anything else that is spilled onto the rim. The best way that I have discovered to tell that is to kind of just run your finger over it. You know how when you've got a wine glass or something like that, and you put your finger, a wet finger on it, and it sings a little bit? These jars are way too thick for it to sing, but you get that same jittery feeling with your finger. When you get that, you know that it's right. Put it on there using the German standard of torque, i.e. it needs to be good and tight. Not too tight, not too loose. And then you just do that for each one of these jars until you've got enough to fill the pressure cooker. Okay, once the jars are all full, grab them, place them into the hot water, packing them as full into the device as you can. There's no reason to leave any extra space.
How much water do you have in there?
Enough to go about halfway up the bottles. So it depends on what size bottles you have. So quarts and pints are going to take a different amount of water. And that's not going to work because that's too much for that. So we're going to have to do three more with the next batch. So we've got 6 in there. The lid to the pressure cooker, it's got a rubber seal on the inside. It's got a pressure relief valve in the middle. And this one has a stopcock that you close. And it's also got a pressure gauge on here so that you can tell how much pressure is in there. There's an arrow on the lid that you point at the word open until it goes down, and then you turn this until it's pointing at the word closed, and then you wait for it to get up to temperature, and you're going to process at 12 to 15 pounds of atmospheric pressure, which means a boiling point of water of between 240 and 250 degrees Fahrenheit. it's on there. I don't remember that, which helps you both kill all the nasties that are inside the jars that nothing is ever perfectly sanitized, and also makes that seal happen that much more effectively. So,
and how long do you leave it in there once it reaches that point?
Once it gets up to the appropriate amount of pressure, you leave it in for about 20 minutes.
Okay.
All right. Last step. After it's cooked for 15, 20 minutes, you take it off the heat. You then have to release the pressure. And completely release the pressure before you try to open it up, or else you're going to get splashed and lots of nasty things will happen. I forgot to mention, you do want to make sure that you're using a pressure canner. A pressure cooker doesn't get up to quite the same amount of pressure. 5 pounds of pressure is usually what's considered a pressure cooker pressure. You want something that's going to get up to at least 10 to 15 pounds in order to be able to can safely. We'll let this hiss, and when it's completely done, we'll open it up and I'll show you how. Okay, once it's done completely hissing, pressure gauge reads 0. You're going to want to take it from closed back to open. You'll notice I am wearing oven mitts because this is very hot. And take each one of the bottles out, put it on a wire rack, or in my case it's a wooden rack, but something that will allow air to flow underneath it to get things to cool off a little bit. Spread them out so that they will have cooler air running around them. And if we're lucky, we'll get to hear a couple of these pop. Depends on how quickly it gets ready to cool off. While that's happening, I'm going to dump a little bit of this water out. And then we can process the 3 that were left. And that's all there is to it. As they pop, you can see what we've got over here. You get a nice amount of tomato sauce that you can keep in your pantry for up to a year and a half or so. You use it within a year. We've used it within 2 years and it's been fine. It's nice that you don't have to use freezer space for that kind of storage. You can just keep it on the shelf in a coolish place like a basement or a pantry. And that's it. We'll put the recipes at the end. And like I said, I don't really measure anything anymore. No 2 batches are quite the same, but it works very well every time you do it.